Hey there, everybody. Welcome to the live stream. I've been away for a couple of weeks, and I've missed you, and I'm really happy to be back. Um, as always, I love to see your comments in the comments so I know that you're really there. Let me know who's here, who you are, where you're from. And as always, again, throughout the live stream, I love to hear your thoughts, your questions, your comments, and I will sort of go back and forth between talking a lot. I guess I shouldn't feel bad about the fact that I talk a lot on the live stream because that's sort of what a live stream is, right? I do feel like I talk a lot other places where I talk too much, but whatever. I'm rambling. I'm having a little bit of a bad allergy day today. It's like the first day, which is kind of remarkable that I'm having any allergy issues. Yarrow is here. Yay. Hi, Yarrow. Nice to see you. So I'll try not to do that. I'll try not to do that right into the microphone, but I will periodically be needing to blow my nose. Usually I have a terrible time in the spring, and fortunately this year, for some reason, I started taking an over-the-counter medication like before allergy season started, and I've been taking it every day, so maybe that's helping. I don't know. Anyway, Spiral Nerd is here. Super excited about today's live stream. Mad Doll is here. Chris from DDS. Yay. So happy to see you all. Um, um, I just realized that I have my notes, my 5 things in my notes app, and I don't have my notes app open, but now it is. All right, so I'm so happy you're here too, Yarrow. It's really exciting. Maybe I should have this a little bit closer to me. I don't know. Is that better? Anyway, sorry. Like I said, I was like right up until I went live, I was dashing around trying to find Kleenex and make sure I had something to drink, and I'm not really quite ready. So it's Emma. Yeah, having a heck of a time with allergies too. Like I said, usually I have a terrible time, but this year has not been so bad, so I guess I can't complain. Usually what I do is just get in bed. But today, I hadn't been here for 2 weeks. So I really wanted to show up for the live stream. So, and this is not nearly as bad as it often gets, so I'm fine. Don't worry about me. The topic for today, I'm looking at my sound levels. That might be actually a little bit high. The topic for today, really high. I don't know what's going on. Is 5 life lessons I wish I had learned before I was 50. And I'm now 57. So I feel like I mostly got a handle on these things after 50. Really after 50. When I left my previous marriage and started to understand myself as neurodivergent. 2 things that happened like sort of at the same time, that sort of coincided with each other. And these are life lessons that are not actually specifically about neurodivergence, although I guess if they're my life lessons and I'm neurodivergent, then they're sort of neurodivergent life lessons. But I suspect that they are lessons that can be useful for anyone. And again, as always, hi Marta, it's nice to see Marta Bratek here. Really nice to have you. These are life lessons that, are not those sorts of things that I figured out overnight or internalized quickly or even have completely internalized. But I do think that they are just a few things that I learned through the process of, I guess I would say like it was in the context of a really traumatic divorce and in the context also of amazing support from a therapist and from my partner and from a good friend of mine, and but also in the context of coming out as neurodivergent and unmasking and building community around neurodivergent liberation. So I would say that it's all of those things that have helped me come to a few key insights that I am more and more internalizing. and life just keeps better and getting better and better for me anyway as I internalize these things. That said, I am simply a, completely uncredentialed human being who is speaking entirely from my own experience. I'm not an expert. I'm not a therapist. I'm not saying that you should have the same insights, or that if you do, that they will have the same effect on your life. Your mileage may vary, but if any of this can be helpful to you, that would be fantastic. Regan is here. Great to see you, Regan. Kitty Litter Zen Garden says, I have 3 years to learn everything I need to know before I turn 50. I'm listening. That's funny. 50 is just a sort of arbitrary, it just happens that I took a really big step in my life. The way I describe it is that I turned my life upside down and shook really hard, and pretty much everything fell out. Like everything. And I don't necessarily recommend doing that. Like, it was a lot of trauma, a lot of loss, a lot of burned bridges, and I don't know. I think that probably was necessary in my life, in my circumstance, and I'm not sure that there was a way that I could have done it differently or better. In retrospect, I can see that there are things that I might have done differently or better, but that's only because I lived through that, right? I don't think that, I think it's easy to project back on our old selves skills and insights that we learn and think, oh, well, if I had just done X, Y, or Z in that situation, then everything would have been better. But the fact is that, it's possible that you couldn't have done X, Y, and Z until you had lived through that situation. And that's where you gained the skills and the insight. So I'm just a big believer in not beating yourself up when you're looking back. Or in the present or going forward. I'm just a big believer in not beating yourself up, period. Yeah. So, and we're all on our own timelines, but the reason I picked the age 50 is simply because that is such a stark and clear demarcation in my life. I left my marriage of almost 30 years when I was 50 and embarked on a whole new life. I didn't think that that's what I was doing. I really didn't think that I was, and I can talk about that another time, but most of what was traumatic and most of the loss that happened after I left my marriage was completely unanticipated, which I guess is probably good because I'm not sure I would have done it if I had known what was coming. But in retrospect, it was all necessary, and it all led me to here. Sorry again about the nose blowing. Okay, so without any further ado, these are maybe kind of in an order, but not in an order of importance. I'm not very good at that. You're supposed to leave the most important one to last because then people will stay, blah, blah, blah. But these are more sort of in the order that they feel related to each other for me. And I'm going to talk a little bit about them and about where and how I learned them. And this first one, I'm actually going to put my phone right here. That's not going to be too distracting for you guys. My first one is one that, I spent 2 years in weekly and even twice a week therapy with a really brilliant psychiatrist in the course of my divorce, and during a really traumatic time when I was having just a complete and utter breakdown. I was in a real mental health crisis for quite a long time, and my psychiatrist was one of the main sort of sources of support and insight during that time. But sometimes I think that if we could have compressed everything that I learned in those 2 years to one insight, which we couldn't, we couldn't. But this is the one that stands out the most for me, and that I continue to think about, and that continues to be helpful to me. And that is, and again, we were doing trauma work, but we never called it that. That's not how we framed our work together. But I do think that this is kind of a trauma insight, that your most intense emotional reactions are probably about the past and not what just happened. So when you when something happens to you in real time, like right now, and you have a really super intense emotional response to that thing. In other words, when you're triggered, right? Like in trauma terms, when something triggers you, that's not usually actually about the thing that just happened. It's about something that happened in your past. So, I mean, in some ways, I guess that's a pretty basic insight if you know anything about trauma, which I did not know anything at all, really, or very little anyway, about trauma at the time. And like I said, we weren't explicitly doing trauma work. So this insight, when he shared it with me, was just like a light bulb that went off in my head. And it was in a specific context. I don't remember the thing that had happened to me, um, but the emotion that I was feeling, um, I always, the emotion that I was feeling was a sort of despair. And not just despair, there's another emotion that I can never remember the name of. I should have written it down. But anyway, I was feeling a very specific emotion. Um, and it was really big. And it was like all consuming. And it was an emotion that that I felt then very frequently in response to stimuli in my environment, like to things that happened to me in real time in my life. And and he didn't tell me you're overreacting. He didn't tell me like that's not a big deal. The thing that just happened to you, get over it, which is what people would always tell me in the past. He said, "This probably isn't about the thing that just happened. This is probably about stuff that happened in your past." And what was interesting is that we didn't really need to go back and unpack all the stuff that had happened in my past. Like just the insight that this particular feeling that I was having, um, that it was, and that I had so often in response to so many things that happened to me, um, was something that had happened to me a long time ago. Um, and just for me anyway, just the insight alone was something that helped me get on top of it in the future, because when I had that feeling and it got really big, I could pretty quickly start saying, oh, wait, right. When I feel this way, um, that's not about the thing that just happened. So I can kind of calm down right in this moment about this thing that just happened and not like spiral out of control and make it even worse. And maybe later I can figure out, how not to have it activate me so much going forward. So anyway, again, I think that that's like pretty basic sort of trauma 101. um, and the sort of the healing of that, like I said, for me, just knowing like the insight alone, and especially being able to attach it to a particular feeling that I had really frequently, was really helpful. I'm sure that for many other people, there are different ways that you heal even after that insight. But for me, the insight alone was just so helpful. Um, so that's one. Sorry. I wish I wish we could take like a little commercial break every time I need to blow my nose. Um, and again, as always, I'd love to see your responses or your thoughts, your insights, your questions, your experiences, anything that you want to um, put in the chat is great. Uh, Mad Doll or Chris says, I tend to much prefer the word activated than triggered for some reason. I agree. I, I think that I think it just feels more accurate to me to describe the sort of sensory experience of it. Activated, like it almost feels to me like I just got like plugged in to like some sort of overwhelming energy source. And I guess triggered also has this like I don't know, this relationship to guns and gun violence, which at least for me it does. I don't know if that word has that sort of connotation, but I don't really love it either. I agree that activated works better for me. Okay, here I go. The second thing that has been really helpful to me and that I really only learned recently for myself is that you can learn how to distinguish between trauma, like being activated by something that's really traumatic, um, which I think of as like a truly unbearable experience. Like when you are being activated by something that is like is bringing a trauma back from your past back into your present. That to me is just an unbearable feeling and experience. But I think that it's a separate experience from a lot of um, other sort of um, unpleasant and uncomfortable experiences or feelings that aren't unbearable. And I would put in that list, for me anyway, it may be that your list is different, but for me, I have sort of come to discover recently that that I was conflating trauma responses with other feelings that I have that aren't actually trauma responses, like, or that the two things would often happen together. And once I was able to get more have more healing around the trauma, I was kind of surprised to see that these other feelings still existed, and it was really easy then to conflate them. So like just basic human uncomfortable, um, unpleasant human emotions like being disappointed and being frustrated and being sad, even being anxious, um, being envious. Like there's just a whole range of um, human emotions that are unpleasant, but that are a part of the spectrum, the broad spectrum of just being human, of being a human being who feels and experiences things. And I mean, as I'm saying it, it sounds kind of simple and obvious, but it wasn't at all for me. Like I think that anytime that I felt one of those things, it wasn't that emotion was activating me. It was almost that I was conflating it, right? And so I kind of handled it in the same way that that I kind of so basically what would happen is that I would like go into a spiral. Like something unpleasant but bearable would happen to me, like I was disappointed or I was frustrated, and then um, I would almost activate myself around that feeling or that experience. Like I would chew on it, I would perseverate about it, I would rehearse it, I would litigate it, I would just like not let go of it like a dog with a bone until my body's response was almost the same as when I actually was activated or triggered, whatever you prefer, by some like to relive a traumatic experience. So again, your mileage may vary, but the insight for me that even when I was able to sort of get on top of like shame spirals, especially, that didn't mean that I wasn't still going to have unpleasant and uncomfortable emotions, sort of residual emotions, um, and that it was okay. That is okay. And in fact, I kind of prefer to be a full a human being with a full range of emotions. I don't like it seems like the opposite of that is kind of a toxic positivity. So let me see what you guys are saying in the comments. Regan says, I used to think I couldn't have trauma because I don't get the stereotypical flashbacks and I don't have one single bad event that I get reminded of. I now know that's only one kind of trauma. Yes, I'm the same way, Regan. I used to think like, oh, I can't talk about my experiences as traumatic because I never like fell out of the sky in a crashing airplane or watch somebody be killed at gunpoint or like whatever, like our class. I was never in a war zone. I wasn't in a natural disaster like a hurricane or a tornado or something like that. So I thought, oh well, then what my experiences, I can't sort of use the framework of trauma to understand them. But then I started to understand more about complex trauma and started to like be like, oh right. Right. um, and more I kind of believe that that just being alive in this time and you know and especially being neurodivergent or non-normative in almost any sort of way um, is kind of traumatic for sure. But then once I started to understand that, then I was starting to, and I also think that shame is a form of trauma. Like, and that was the insight that I had about distinguishing between trauma and unpleasant emotions came to me when I was having an experience that would normally have caused me to spin out in just like a total shame spiral. Basically, it was a family event that people were coming from all over the place to come to, not all over, but multiple places to come to. And we were supposed to be going to Longwood Gardens, which is a beautiful gardens near Philadelphia, but you needed tickets. And I had gotten tickets, but it turned out, and I discovered just as we were getting up to the window to show the tickets, that I had gotten tickets for the next week, not the week that we were actually there. And there was nothing they could do. They were completely booked. They were completely full. And there was no other option for us to get into the gardens that day. And here we were with all of these assorted family members. And what normally would have happened to me is that I would have gone into just a massive, massive shame spiral about that and just been completely overwhelmed and shut down. And it would have been awful. And I was able to not go into that shame spiral, which I really do think of as a trauma response. Um, but and that was good. Like that felt great that I didn't go down that route, that I was able to disrupt that. But what I thought was going to happen is that like 10 minutes later, I would just be like, oh, well, that didn't work out. So let's just figure out the next thing and let's still have fun. And like I wasn't able to just jump right into, oh, it's fine, it's no big deal. Like it kind of was a big deal, and I was really disappointed, and I was sad, and maybe even a little embarrassed and frustrated, and I couldn't just shake it right away, like immediately. And that was when I had that insight, like, oh, but this is different than shame. This is different than like your typical trauma response of like going down a complete shame spiral. This is just like a normal reaction to that experience. Like, oh, darn, this is really frustrating and it's even kind of sad. Um, and and so then I just let myself feel it because it was frustrating and sad. And, we did figure out how to redeem the day and we found something else to do and nobody was mad at me. Like that was the kind of amazing thing. But it was just afterwards, as I was looking back on it, it was like the key insight that came from that was like, oh, right. Um, even though I was able to disrupt the shame and not go down into that like trauma response over which you sometimes have like no control at all, it was still frustrating. And I'm a human being who has a wide range of human emotions, and I kind of like that. Like I, I want to feel all the feels, right? Um, yeah, so let's see. Crystal Collins. Hi, Crystal. Nice to see you. Is this related to what is popularly known as rejection sensitivity? Because I experience the same sort of sensations. Oh, I see there's a bunch of comments. All right. Cool. That's wonderful. Crystal, I have a lot to say about rejection sensitivity, so-called rejection sensitivity. Rejection sensitive dysphoria is this supposed syndrome that a doctor named William Dodson came up with. And his argument is that it is that the propensity of neurodivergent people, specifically ADHD people, to be acutely sensitive to rejection. He argues that that's it's a bio-neurological genetic component of neurodivergence, or specifically of ADHD. And he makes that claim with literally no evidence. Like, I literally wrote to him and asked him for his evidence, and he literally admitted to me that he has none, and yet he continues to push this syndrome. My argument is that looks an awful lot like trauma, like complex trauma. Like, yeah, when you get rejected a lot in your life over and over and over, you're going to get sensitive to it. And neurodivergent people are rejected a lot. Anyway, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole because I could literally do a whole episode on rejection, so-called rejection sensitive dysphoria. But you're exactly right, that is connected to what I'm talking about. And I do have a video that is I think actually just a clip of a live that I did on Instagram once that is all about this. So you might want to look for that. Let's see. No, Crystal says I'm new, so I'm still sorting out proper terminology. No, you're spot on to identify rejection sensitivity as close as sort of similar to what I'm talking about. I think that the kind of like huge rejection sensitivity that we often feel is sort of what I was talking about in the first point, which is that when you feel something as outsized as that, it's usually about something that happened to you, something bad that happened to you in the past, but not necessarily like one bad thing. It often is, in the case of complex trauma, the accumulation of many, many, many bad things. But yeah, that's exactly the sort of thing I'm talking about. And no apologies necessary. Your terminology is spot on. Spiral Nerd says, yeah, my therapist often asks me, does this feeling feel familiar? And sometimes a follow-up like, are there other situations, memories that are standing out to you when you felt this way? And then they go on to say, I find those questions and explorations really helpful. Yeah, that's great. Like, I'd never really thought of like that set of questions to ask, but those are exactly the right questions, I suppose. And I suppose that's why therapists get a lot of training that I don't have. But yeah, I think that asking yourself, like, is this a familiar feeling? And when have you felt it in the past is very similar to some of the things that I've been talking about, for sure. And I think that it can be helpful to start asking yourself, like, when do you remember, like, how far back do you remember thinking about feeling these things? But again, I'm not a therapist, and so I'm not going to try to like delve into anybody's childhood or help them. Like, I don't have the skills to talk about how you heal from these things, but for me anyway, the insights alone have been kind of aha moments that have been helpful to me. Yeah, Regan says rejection sensitivity is a new buzzword and it is just a theory at the moment. Not enough research to know if it is a unique thing or if it's just a trauma response. I mean, what I would say, Regan, is that I totally agree with you, but I would go a step further and say it's not just that there's not enough research to know if it's a unique thing. I would say that there is literally no research at all. There's none at all. And to me, if it looks like trauma, it acts like trauma, it responds like the medications that Dodson suggests using are medications that are used for trauma. I think that I'm gonna digress here for a minute and get on my soapbox about rejection sensitive dysphoria, and then I promise I'll get back on track. But my theory about why Dodson and others are like not just like they're not just clinging to this notion, but like doubling down, putting their heels in, um, and insisting that it really is a thing, which is basically what they have done in the last couple of years. They, there's two reasons. One is that people who have come up with these so-called syndromes and disorders, like they have staked a reputation on that, right? Like Dodson is known for this, and it's a lot of his work, and so it's hard for anyone to say, not only was I wrong, but I was wrong about sort of one of the central things that I came up with in my work as as a psychiatrist who works. I don't know if Dodson is a psychiatrist. I'm not sure. I think he's a psychiatrist who works with ADHD people. But the second reason I think that it's so hard is because it's not a critique of Dodson. It's a critique of the whole pathologizing paradigm, right? Like the medical paradigm, the medical model insists that the problems are all inside of us, inside of our brains, that they are ways that we are broken and unfixable. Um, and and because of the ways that our selves and our brains have been cast, that is precisely what has caused the trauma that causes the response. So not only would they have to admit that they're wrong about specifically rejection sensitive dysphoria, but they would have to admit that like the entire paradigm in which they have spent their entire professional lives has in fact been the cause of our trauma that is causing this response. I don't know if that makes sense. But I do think that it's really twisty and it's really hard to unwind it because people have so much invested in the medical model. Like, yeah, you can make so much more from the medical model of disability than you can from like liberation movements, like the sort of liberation diversity kind of paradigm, right? All right, let's see. Liminal Lizzie says, sounds like this guy has some stuff of his own to resolve around failure and rejection. Well, I think that that's absolutely the case. And I think that it's interesting. Like, I'm not, I'm not really into like, I mean, obviously I'm not into judging people at all, especially people, I mean, not anybody, but especially not people I don't know. And I don't like to psychoanalyze, but it does seem to me that often a lot of these people, like Barkley in particular, um, uh, and again, I realize that we're getting off track, but I think we have time. Um, Russell Barkley, as I understand it, I'm not sure that this is true. I haven't tracked it down for myself, but I've heard the story enough to believe that it probably is true. Had a brother who was ADHD and who died in a car accident. And obviously his family experienced and he connects the two things, like as almost causal. Like he died in a car accident because he was ADHD. And And so, like, obviously, he and his family experienced this terrible tragedy, this terrible trauma, um, and and I really sometimes wonder if he isn't just like projecting his own trauma onto the entire neurodivergent community um, in some of his kind of thinking. And I think that probably it's entirely possible that the same thing is true of William Dodson. I will say, and again, I don't know either of them personally, and I haven't spent much time reading up about either of them, but from what I've heard anecdotally, Russell Barkley really is kind of a jerk. Like he's condescending, he's rude, he really looks down on neurodivergent people. He really does think that we're just sick and a burden on society and that we need to be fixed to the extent that we can be. Dodson, as I understand it, is actually a really lovely, lovely person who really cares about, has worked his whole life with neurodivergent people, the ADHD people, and really cares about us, and really does, for the most part, believe that we're whole human beings, who are capable of the full wide range of human experience. So I do want to put that out there, that I'm much more critical, honestly, of Russell Barkley than I am of Dodson. But they both just, I guess maybe I feel more frustrated by Dodson because it seems to me that he ought, like, given all of that, that maybe he ought to, like, have the the humility to just say, oh, maybe I was wrong. And it doesn't seem, at least to the extent that I have looked at anything of his stuff lately, it seems to me that what he's done instead is just sort of doubled down. Um, uh, Lizzie says, you start getting into allegory of the cave territory, not knowing what you're unaware of. Yeah, I think that that's true for sure. I mean, I'm not as familiar with that thinking, that allegory, but absolutely, the not knowing what you don't know what you don't know. Like, that's a hard thing for all of us, right? And Regan says, I don't want to get you more off track, but, like, why not? Like, we're in a spiral, right? That's what we do. But an idea to put a pin in for later. It seems that Jessica McCabe has had a change of heart lately and is moving away from the medical model in her videos. Oh, um, that's interesting. In favor of self-advocating more. I wonder if it's because she has gotten trauma therapy now. Well, I couldn't speculate at all. Um, and that's interesting. And I may take a look. I haven't looked at Jessica's work in quite a long time. Um, yeah, there was a time on Twitter when all of, I like to call them the ADHD big girls, Jessica and Danny Donovan and Renee Brooks and a whole bunch of them, who really didn't like my work, like, blocked me, all of them en masse, blocked me on Twitter so that they didn't have to be subjected to the terrible things that I was saying. And so maybe it was petty, but in return, I just stopped looking at their work too. So I haven't looked at Jessica's stuff for a really long time. Although, honestly, she was like my entree into thinking about ADHD. And I think that there's a lot of her work that is real, obviously resonates with people and is really helpful. I think that the big difference, like, she even has stuff about shame. Like, there's that video that I did see that's called The Wall of Awful, which is really a great video. Um, the difference between me and Jessica is that I think that she thinks that, or at least in the past she did, thinks that the wall of awful is just like something that happens to us, like intrinsically, out of the blue, like it just happens to us because we're so broken. Whereas I think that the wall of awful, which is basically another way of talking about shame and sort of the cumulative effects of shame, is political. I think that shame is political. And in fact, that was going to be one of the lessons. I originally had 10 and I knew I wouldn't get through 10. So maybe I'll do the other 5 another time, which are all shame related. But anyway, yeah. So that's interesting. Thank you, Regan. I will totally take a look at Jessica's stuff and see if any of the newer stuff resonates a little bit more. All right, I'm going to take a break from looking at the comments. And I'm feeling really distracted because I'm looking at my image in the monitor and it looks like I'm, like, really overexposed, like there's too much light, but there you have it. We're just going to live with an overexposed video because I'm not going to try to fix it right now. All right, number 3. Number 3, what I wrote down is, it's almost always about them, not you. And this has, like, maybe been one of the most life-changing insights for me, is realizing that, like, I'm not actually the center of almost anybody's universe except my own. And that when other people are behaving in ways that make me feel bad, or that feel like they're rejecting me or critiquing me, or like being mean to me, or things that normally, under normal circumstances in my life, previous to the last few years, I would have taken intensely personally, and would have chewed on and not been able to let go of. What I've come to realize is that those things are almost always about the other person, right? And that, like, we don't have to, it is so much easier said than done, but that we don't have to take it personally. Like, we can say, oh, in fact, we can, like, sort of look at that other person from a place of compassion, or we can just choose to have a boundary from them. But we don't have to let them make us feel bad or any sort of way, right? Um, and even when it's clear that when their critique is about us, like whatever it is that they're saying or doing is explicitly about us, um, it still can be about them. Like the fact that they are reacting in such a, it sort of relates back to the first point, which is if they're having really big activated responses to something that we said or did, um, often, I guess I wouldn't say always, but often, those responses on their part are about their past and not about what just happened with us. Like, there are obviously some exceptions to this, and I'm not at all advocating like not taking responsibility for things that we do that harm other people, or not acknowledging privilege or harm or any of those kinds of things. But I think that in our just sort of run of the mill kinds of interactions with other people, like, we don't have to take to heart what other people are saying and doing, even if it's about us. That it really is possible. It's not easy. And even for me, like, it takes me a long time sometimes to shake things off, and sort of dig myself out. But just again, the insight is helpful to me that other people are having their own shit, going on for them. And it's often related to their stuff in their past. And like sometimes we can be in the kind of relationship where we can gently suggest that to them, and be helpful and be good friends to them. And sometimes we can't, and we have to have our own boundaries and take care of our own selves. So that's not an easy one, but I have found that it's really helpful to me to, for the most part, not take things personally. And I think that can be especially useful in situations where we're not actually even in relationship with people, like on social media, like if people say something in the comments, or tag you in a post and make some remark about you or whatever. Like in that context, I think that it really is true. And I have found it fairly simple. Just like, oh, well, that's a them thing, not a me thing. Like, um, if people are just being mean, or piling on, or like super snarky, I'm just like, well, my inclination is just to walk away. And in fact, my inclination more and more is to not even be on in those situations, to not even put myself in those situations. Um, so, uh, so that is the next one. Let's see what you guys have said. ARF says, being trauma, I think that you're talking about rejection sensitivity, makes more sense because my ND, I'm not sure if that's boyfriends or best friends, don't experience as intense reactions from rejection as I do, because I've experienced intense recent rejection, but they had support and had healed more. Okay, I'm not sure I completely understand it, but I do think that the gist of it is that, yeah, like, I think that our reactions around rejection can actually, this is another tiny bit of evidence, like, just like, again, it's just anecdotal, um, but the fact that the notion that rejection sensitivity is baked into the neurology of the ADHD person suggests that it can't be changed. And I know that for me, in the last 5 years, I have gone from somebody who is highly reactive to rejection, like highly so, to the point where I was just like debilitated by even the merest hint of it, like classic rejection sensitive dysphoria, to somebody who really can, for the most part, let things roll off my back. So I do think that we can heal for sure. Let's see. I'm going to come back to these things from Crystal in a minute. Marta says, to separate what is somebody's stuff or mine is in difficult situations. It helps a lot. Choosing right people to interact and to say say no to unconscious species is freedom. I'm not sure I completely understand that, but the general gist of it is that being able to separate out what's your stuff and what's somebody else's stuff, I agree, is super helpful, right? And can be real freedom, right? I think it can both make you able to be more compassionate and empathetic and helpful as a friend, but it also can help you know where the boundaries have to be. Like at some point, if somebody is projecting all of their trauma onto you and having, implicating you in their own stuff, there does come a point where it's healthy for you to just say, this isn't going to work, and have a boundary around it. Yeah. Ketsia says, this makes me think about the advice we got to not taking things personally, but sometimes I think about what about me made someone think that they could get away with a thing. Yeah. I mean, yeah. I'm not sure that I'm completely understanding your point, Ketsia, but if I'm understanding it correctly, what I think you're saying and what resonates for me is that sometimes you can take that as information, right? Like I like to say in terms of design, thinking that there is no such thing as failure, there's just information. Well, sometimes I think that like the failure in a relationship, when somebody projects their stuff onto you, that can be information. It can be information about what kind of relationship you can be in with that person. But it can also be information about like how they perceive you. And you can start asking yourself, like, is that, like, am I projecting that self? Like, are they perceiving me with a mask on that I could take off, right? That I could choose to discard, and maybe be a different version of myself that maybe that doesn't happen to so much. So I think that to me, that's a different thing than self-blame, than taking on the other person's, stuff. I do think that it's healthy to like investigate like what's going on in this relationship, and try to figure out, like, to the extent that you can, what role you're playing and how you can change that to be more healthy in the dynamic and in the relationship. But I also think that, yeah, you can ask yourself, is there some way that I'm playing a part in this? And if so, is that a part a role that I want to keep playing, right? Am I capable of changing something about myself inside of myself so that I'm no longer engaging in that role? Anyway, I'm not sure if that's what you meant, but that's definitely been, and I want, again, I want to say a million times that A, none of this is easy, and B, I'm hardly an expert. I'm only speaking from my own experience, not from any sort of theory or credentialed place as a therapist or anything like that. I'm just talking about my own insights and what has been helpful to me. All right. I still have 4 and 5 to go. And they're related. Okay, so 4 and 5 are related. The first one, number 4, is that self-love and self-acceptance doesn't have to come first, um, before you can really be loved by others and accepted by others. Like, I think that that's sort of a meme out there, right? That like is part of the whole, I think, like part of the whole self-care industry, which really has become its own sort of industrial complex trying to sell us all sorts of things. And the sort of theory that they put forward is that you should buy our self-care products and services because until you learn to take care of yourself and love yourself, nobody is ever going to be able to take care of you and love you. Um, and I just think that that's specious and false. I think that it's not a straight line with like a first and then you know and then you do this first and then these good things will happen to you. I think it is more of a spiral, like so many things, and that it can become like this, um, that loving yourself and accepting yourself, unmasking, becoming true to yourself, and being loved by others, being accepted by others, seeing yourself reflected in others. Um, all of that becomes this sort of mutually reinforcing virtuous spiral. We talk a lot about downward spirals, right? But there are also, I think, mutually reinforcing virtuous or upward spirals where, loving yourself makes you lovable, um, and and then being loved, it makes you love yourself more, etc. Like, I think that it's not either or. It's not first then. It's like all at the same time. And so I think that sometimes people have this sense that they should or must sort of isolate themselves and fix themselves before they can seek out companionship and relationship and community. That, like, especially if we've had bad experiences, um, in relationships and in community, which many of us have, and especially when we get to that point where we have the insight that, like, oh, we were part of the problem. Like, not that we should feel ashamed of it or that it was our fault or anything, but like, I think that there does come a point where we can objectively say, oh yeah, I was super reactive. I got really activated. I was super needy, um, and that was difficult. In that made that relationship difficult. That made being part of that community difficult, and that's part of the reason that those relationships didn't work out. I think that we can get to a place where we see that, um, and then sometimes think, oh, well, then the solution must be that first I have to fix all of that in myself before I can find new community and new relationships, um, and be loved again, right? And I just don't think that that's true. Like, I think that it's very hard to heal without being loved. I think it's very hard to do any of this work completely isolated and out of community. And maybe I said that 4 and 5 were related. Um, but they're almost, actually, now that I look at them, they're almost exactly the same thing. Honestly, the last one, what I wrote was, I think that they're sort of related. They're just inspired by different things. Number 5 is, even if you're an introverted hermit like me, you need community and peer support. Um, so I think that the first one, number 4, what I was talking about is the tendency to isolate ourselves and to try to fix ourselves before we allow ourselves to be in relationship, because we're afraid of, damaging those relationships, or that we don't deserve love and community until we can be better, right? The second one, number 5, is more about like the tendency of some of us, especially those of us who are just sort of hermetic and and super introverted. Like, it's hard work for me to be in community. It's hard work for me to be in relationship, especially in real life. Like, I actually find that online community is much easier for me, than like in-person community, and that in-person friendships, like embodied friendships, are an enormous amount of work for me, because I get so I get into such sensory overload in those when I'm physically with someone. And then afterwards, I do get into these spirals of, like, did I talk too much, or was I too weird, or I feel like I was really loud, and like, so my tendency, and this was really reinforced by the pandemic, is to just not try to spend time with the few. I mean, I don't have that many friends in real life. Like, I think of all of you as real life friends, but I mean like embodied, like people who I can spend literally physical time with in the same room. I don't have very many people in my life like that, other than my immediate family. Um, but even though I do have increasingly a few of them, it's hard for me. I have to push myself to seek out those relationships and embody them. Um, but I think it's important. I really do. I don't think that we need to hold ourselves to any sort of neurotypical norm of like what our social lives should look like, or how frequently we should spend time, you know, in the same room with other people. Um, and I'm not even just talking about uh, embodied in the same space, physical space kinds of relationships. Those are just the ones that are especially hard for me. I'm just talking about any kind of relationship, or any kind of community, or any kind of peer support. I think that for those of us who are intensely introverted or shy, or feel awkward and weird, which like I literally do all the time, I think that we still like, so it can be really easy to self isolate to a point that is not healthy. Like, human beings are social creatures, and we, even those of us who have almost a vocation for being hermits, which is how I think of myself, like it's almost like a religious vocation, my tendency towards being a hermit. Um, I still think that we need each other, and that we should and can, push ourselves a little bit with the right people. I think that part is key to seek that out. So, let's see. Let's see. Um, Emma says, realizing those things, that I might have been part of the problem, and that I am still inherently worthy of love in the midst of that. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that that's such a hard one, Emma. Um, like, it takes both a real kind of humility and strength. Like you have to, it's like one of those paradoxes where you have to both be really humble and also confident, right? Which I guess shouldn't really be contradictions, but I think in our culture they're sort of seen as paradoxical. Um, and I think it's something that just comes, that also can come with practice. And I am by no stretch of the imagination suggesting that I'm very good at this. Um, I just like I'm good enough at it to know that it's something to strive for. That's as far as I am, I think. Um, Sort of understanding, like, even when I look back now on the trauma of my divorce, like for a long time, I just felt like a flat out victim. Like I felt like I had just been like knocked over completely unjustly and had terrible things happen to me. All of which is true. Those things did happen. But when I look back on it now, I can also see like, oh yeah, I played a big part in what happened. I don't blame myself, because this is sort of what we were talking a little bit about at the beginning, I think, is that I was doing the best I could under the circumstances. The insights that I now have about my role in that can be useful to me going forward, and useful to me in my life right now in real time. But there's nothing useful that can come of feeling shame about the fact that I played a part in the really hard stuff that happened. And especially like the thing that's really hard for me is seeing how clearly my children were affected by that time, and how I played a part in that. Right. But there's nothing I can do about that, um, other than just be grateful that I have the insight now, and hopefully more and more increasingly able to incorporate that going forward into my life. Um, yeah. Ketsia says, introverted solitary hermits unite. Yes, Ketsia. 100%. Jay says, I always say I communicate with many but trust very few. Friend numbers are very low but highly valuable. Yeah, I would agree. I would totally agree. Oh, and look, your handle is Jay, but the next comment says, love your camera quality, homie. Miss ya. It's ADHD. John here. Oh, I can't even tell you how excited I am that you're here, John. For those of you who don't know, first of all, run, don't walk, and follow John on Instagram. That's his handle, ADHD John. And he was part. I should tell this whole story sometime. But in October of 2019, a small group of us agreed to start posting some stuff for ADHD Awareness Month, and I had just started my Instagram account then, and 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 I would never have dived into what then became like my account and my work and this live stream and DDS or any of it, if it hadn't been for the companionship and the support of this little group of us who just sort of, there were a few leaders in the group, and I was not one of them by any stretch, who said, hey, let's do this. And so I did. And John was part of that. And so I always think that he is part of, like, I don't know, like we go way back in terms of the work that I'm doing. And he gets to like claim pride of place as like part of the foundation for all of that. So it means a lot to me that you're here. Nice. And Ketsia, who is a newer friend of mine, who is part of DDS, says, this is so encouraging to hear from you, Marta. As someone with a family, how would you say we can learn how to learn social, emotional skills if we never learn the protocols of the social world? Someone with a family. I would love for you, I'm going to start talking about that, but Ketsia, I would love to hear a little bit more about what you're thinking. But in general, what I would say for me, healing has come from rejecting the pathology paradigm of the medical model of disability and of neurodivergence, learning about what my strengths are and pursuing them, and getting more and more comfortable with being a weirdo and being kind of marginalized, like sort of embracing that, like taking it on, right? Which has sort of always been my story. Like I think that I've always thought of myself as like living on the margins of various communities, and that sometimes can be really hard, but in other ways, it can be really empowering and powerful. Like it gives you a vantage point when you live on the margins to see things differently. So I think that like not only recognizing that you are marginalized by the society, but not embracing the oppressive dynamics that created the marginalization, but embracing the position, the vantage that it gives you, and also the community that it can give you with other marginalized people. So so that's sort of like a paradigm shift, I think, in the first instance, and starting to think about neurodivergent stuff as liberation, as a liberation movement that's connected to all the other liberation movements. let's I'm gonna look at your comment now and then get back to my train of thought if I can. I meant to say of your own. Let's see. Someone with a family of your own. And by the way, this community has made me feel held in these times for sure. But like, I know you talked about going away for a weekend with your fam, and I realized, I think that you're writing another comment. I mean, what I will say about my own family, and I try not to share too much of my children's stories because they are their own people, and their stories aren't mine to tell. And they're both in their own ways kind of more private people than I am. Like I'm just like a really weird weirdo. I'm intensely introverted and I'm a hermit, but I have some boundaries about some things, but like for the most part, I'm not a very private person. Like I generally just tend to put things out there and I don't mind sharing those things. Um, uh, yeah. So, when I go out, this is Ketsia again. When I go out, I totally feel like an alien, especially because we didn't go out much as a kid. So it sounds funny, but even knowing how to control tone of voice when ordering at a restaurant, for example. Yeah, okay. Well, I will say that like there were so many things in my previous marriage that didn't work. But one of the things that was actually kind of good about it was that well, in this particular context, I will say. Um, it's also part of what didn't work. But my ex was is very neurotypical and very extroverted and very outgoing and very, very, very socially adept. So on the one hand, that was not great for me because our lives were so intensely social in ways that were really damaging to me. But on the other hand, she gave me sort of an example of how to act. Like I could mimic her and get away with stuff. So that was helpful. And I think that like there were lots of ways that our parenting, I'm sure, damaged our children, but there were lots of good things that came from the sort of different sets of skills that we brought to our parenting of our children. So like even when they were really little, we used to call her the adventure mama and me the comfort mama. So I was the one who the kids came to when they were like emotionally upset or had hurt themselves or whatever. And I love to hold them and co-sleep with them and carry them around in a sling and all of that. And she was like taking them on bike trips and going to see Shakespeare with them and like, doing all these things. It was just sort of, like I said, it was kind of relentless for me, the going, 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 doing all the time. That wasn't really working for me, but I do think that um, that together that to the extent that my kids are okay, and I think that mostly they are, um, I think that they got sort of a a dual set of skills. As for me, though, like I think that I sort of went the opposite extreme when I left that marriage. First, I just needed to heal from how relentlessly social it had been, and it was really hard. And I never even really realized what was hard about it. And I do now realize in retrospect that she and my community like sort of judged me for the ways that I wasn't very good at being neurotypical and social, like being too loud or being too withdrawn, like either way. Like it was, I was either too loud or I was too withdrawn, but there was like never any sort of like perfect Goldilocks moment. And I do think that I was really pretty harshly judged. People thought of me as like really arrogant and conceited and um, overbearing, either like arrogant and withdrawn or overbearing. Um, so I think that for me, I needed very much to withdraw for quite a long time to heal from that, and that happened to not happily for any other reason in the world. But happily for me, the pandemic sort of created a circumstance where I could withdraw in a way that was socially acceptable. And I think that that was really healing for me. Um, so, so learning those skills, I think that the first thing for me is like just like giving yourself permission to be somebody who doesn't have them, and like feeling okay about it, um, and letting yourself heal so that you know you're not quite so raw around those situations, and then kind of like slowly taking steps, and then doing that with trusted people. I think that that's the key to everything. Like the key to everything in terms of relationship, social situations, um, is finding the right people. It's not just finding anybody. It's not just finding any community or any set of friends. It's finding the right ones. And I think more and more for me, like I just need I just need other weirdos around me. Like I just need to surround myself with neurodivergent people. You know, on a wide spectrum of neurodivergences. I'm not just talking about ADHD and autism. Um, but that's I think that that's the key, and I guess that brings me back to my final points. There are that we do really, as much as we may be introverts, as much as we may be hermits, we do really need each other. We do need community. We are social creatures just like every other human being. We're not outside of the human family. We're just really different in how we interact with one another. And so I think the best solution is to find each other and build our own communities, you know. Um, and then finally, I guess, as Devin Price says in his book Unmasking Autism, what's good for us is actually going to be good for lots of people, like even neurotypical people, and um, and he makes a pretty persuasive argument that there really isn't such a thing as neurotypical. That neurotypical is just another um, sort of idealized standard, unrealistic, oppressive, idealized standard that's demanded of all of us. And some people who we call neurotypical are better able to fake it than the rest of us who we call neurodivergent. But basically, we're all faking it. Like this standard that is demanded of us, it's a standard that um, that basically sort of treats us like robots, that is good for production, it's good for capitalism, it's good for a white supremacist capitalist society, right? But it's not really good for many people at all. Even the ones who like theoretically are doing well under it, you know, the billionaires, like I, I have to believe that they're not actually all that happy or healthy or fulfilled either. So, um, all right, well, that's what I've got. And I realize I'm going over, but I am going to go back because there were a whole series of comments that I wanted to look at, but I wanted to get to some other folks too. But I think that this is important. It's from Crystal. So Crystal says, so I'm neurodivergent, ADHD for sure. I also may be autistic. I'm sorting that out. I notice that with autism, therapists use language like, oh, okay, you're autistic, be yourself. Do you feel safe to unmask? And when it comes to ADHD, the language in therapy is like, oh, just focus, bring your mind back. Right. Um, you should wake up earlier and get organized. It just feels like ADHD is treated like a thing that needs to be changed and that I could do better if I tried harder. But I do try hard. I want to find ways to improve and make my life easier, but I want to feel accepted and not like I'm a constant failure. I feel like I have to mask too, and I want to feel safe enough to unmask and relax, but it's hard to do when I'm believed to be unmotivated or disorganized, even by professionals. Okay, I'm so glad I came back to this, Crystal, because um, I do think that um, I haven't, let me think. Let me organize my thoughts here for a second. I think that the the sort of therapy that you're talking about that many ADHD people experience is from what I call the ADHD industry or the ADHD industrial complex. It's like a very skills based kind of therapy or coaching or support that is intended to get ADHD people back on track. Like the idea is that, oh, neurotypical people are on this track, and ADHD people, because of something that's wrong and broken in their brains, have fallen off the track. And what we should do is come up with strategies and hacks and skills and products that will not adapt their world over there on the other side of the track, but instead get them back onto the track so that they can keep marching along with the rest of us and be successful, cogs in the wheel of industrial capitalism. Or anyway, and I think that there is that happens to autistic kids too, very much. Like I think that is sort of the theory of ABA, which I don't want to get into and I don't know enough about, but I think that the basic theory of it is to get autistic kids acting more like they're neurotypical so that they can be on this track, right? And that's basically the medical model. And the idea that there's something wrong with us, inside of us, that's broken, and that we need to try to fix it so that we can be normal again and get on with life and be successful in all of the ways that our contemporary society expects us to be successful. I think that you may be right, especially in somewhat more progressive settings, and especially around autistic adults who have who have come to therapy as autistic adults, that there may be a little bit of a softening of that. But I think that is less about the therapists or the industries, the autism industry being a little bit softer or more accommodating. I think it's more that there has been enormous amounts of self-advocacy on the part of autistic people, much more so, much more radical self-advocacy, liberation movement type self-advocacy than there is from ADHD, the ADHD community, which is much less radical, which is much more in the pocket of neoliberalism, right? So so that's the only reason that I can imagine that you're getting a little bit, or that you're hearing more sort of accommodating kinds of thoughts around autism, whereas what you're hearing from ADHD folks is more like along the lines of get yourself back on track so that you can be a good cog in the wheel of capitalism. I think that that's actually coming, now that I think of it. There are these industries of therapists and coaches and so-called helping professionals, and also people selling courses and products and all the rest of it that is aimed at both communities. But I would just say that the ADHD community on the whole has been less radical, has bought into that model more. Like somebody who just up above in the comments was saying that Jessica McCabe, whose channel is How to ADHD, was very much in that medical model, and they're suggesting that maybe she's coming over a little bit, which would be fantastic, to a more sort of social model of disability. Whereas I think that autistic people, to the extent that there has been sort of a voice of an autistic community, sort of a community voice around issues of autism, it has been a much more radical self-advocating kind of voice. Like autistic people are the ones who came up with the notion of nothing about us without us, etc., etc. So I don't know if that answers your question at all, Crystal. It seems like that might even be like a kind of interesting um, live stream all of its own. I guess the other thing that I will say is that more and more I'm starting to suspect that these really discrete diagnostic categories that we have of autism and ADHD are really false silos that we get put in, and that more is just like there's just being different from what's expected of us as like what is the norm, and then there's like this wide spectrum of divergence from that, and that we all sort of fall in various places at different times on that spectrum. That's more and more my thinking. All right. Let's see. Kent says, yes, weirdo friends. I'm a big fan of weirdo friends. Ketsia says that response was so generous. Oh, I'm so glad. And I agree. Thank you, Ketsia. That's really lovely. Kitty Litter Zen Garden says another great episode. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Regan says your mileage may vary when it comes to how therapists treat ADHD for sure. Yeah, like I've literally never seen a therapist about ADHD, so I'm just talking about what I've heard. I've never seen a therapist about either of those conditions. Like I stopped therapy. I basically started to understand myself as neurodivergent just as I was kind of leaving therapy, which was probably like a good sequence to do it. Anyway, thank you all so much for being here. I'm not sure what's coming up, but I think soon Jesse Meadows is going to come back and we're going to talk about something. And I don't want to make any promises, but I just read this amazing article in the New York Times that I think that I kind of want to talk about. So, and I think Jesse might be interested in that too. So I don't know if that's going to be next week, but sometime soon Jesse will be back and we'll have another conversation. And in the meantime, thank you all so much for being here. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. And I'll see you next week, unless I see you sooner in Divergent Design Studios. And if there isn't already a link in the description below, I'll put one if you want to join and you haven't already. All right. Bye.